in my experience, are subject to burnout from diminishing returns. And then at the very end, he says, if you want to stay in for the long haul and lead a life that is free from illusions either propagated by you or embraced by you, then I suggest you learn to recognize and avoid the symptoms of the zealot and the person who knows that he is right. For the dissenter, the skeptical mentality is at least as important as any armor principle. So I think I slightly agree with the last point. The first point, though, is good. He says that zealots can break but not bend. They're not going to change their views, but they have to be broken to really change. And often that's jail or death if you're really a zealot. And this is what happens in history, of course, with people that are trying to change human nature. But to the last point, I think a slightly skeptical attitude is fine. I think it's okay to hear other ideas. That doesn't mean that every single conversation you have changes you. I think that would be a little bit ridiculous, because that would suggest that the views you hold, you're not holding for really any reason. That you were that malleable, I don't think that's a good position to take. I don't think Hitchens is trying to say that, though. I think he's just saying that you should have a look at other people's views and consider them. And you may learn something. If not changing your point of view a little bit, you'll certainly learn what other people think and why they think, which is always very important, why they think it. But I don't agree with the radical skeptical view, which I don't think Hitchens is saying here, is that you should be completely open-minded to anything, and you should always learn from every conversation. I don't think that's always possible, because, like I said, that would suggest that your views are so malleable that you don't have any reason for holding, that you have views du jour, like you just change your views every day. I don't think that would be a very uneducated person. Maybe getting to be educated, but unless they have a really bad memory. But I think it's fine to be able to consider other views and not assume that you have everything fashioned in your head perfectly and that you don't need to read anymore or think anymore. I don't think that's possible. For the longest time, everyone thought that Aristotle's views were perfect and all that you know. He was at one time called the philosopher. It's funny, Plato is often, maybe it was Whitehead's comment that everything is a foothold, all of philosophy is a foothold to Plato. But it seems to be that most people think that Plato was the greatest philosopher. But at one time, actually, Aristotle was considered, actually for probably almost 1,000 years, Aristotle was far more read and considered than Plato. But a lot of his views have turned out to be incorrect. I actually think that a lot of people don't understand Aristotle today. I actually think a lot of knowledge today has been lost. And I think that's what's actually brought about postmodernism, for example. It's a vacuum. It's a vacuum of knowledge and understanding. So when you get views like that going on, there's just a loss of knowledge. The academics, or at least the people who discuss ideas, and not scientists, but people who discuss ideas, I think actually don't know a lot of the knowledge of the past. And that's the problem, I think, of today, and the kinds of views that you see espoused. They're very myopic in what the kind of stuff they read. They may have a knowledge of only the last 100 years. And, of course, they're going to make the same mistakes. Descartes and John Locke tried to make systems without learning anything in the past. They tried to make their own systems from scratch without learning from the ancient Greeks. And they made a lot of mistakes that the ancient Greeks did not make. I think that's what's happening again today, is that a lot of that knowledge is lost and not learned, and people are making mistakes that the ancient Greeks did not. But it's going to become harder and harder to learn all true that humans have ever come up with, because we have brains that are limited, and it's going to be just eventually, if not today, already impossible to learn and to consider all the knowledge that's ever been thought about. It just might be possible that to be like, I guess if you took specifically a philosopher, let's say, it just may be possible that today 4 years is just not enough to do a PhD in philosophy. There's just too much. You'd have to specialize, and I think specializing in philosophy is not very productive. Like, unless you're going to be analytical. To have philosophers used to espouse a wider view of things, used to be system builders, and be the, at least, well, primary source of wisdom, I guess. But it's going to become harder and harder to be able to do all that. And I think that is a loss of today, that people can't do that. But there are a few who can. So now on page 37, we have kind of a similar point made about trying to control human nature and bring about a utopia. So he says, you can achieve 100% control over humans, and if you could not go on doing so. It is, fortunately, too much responsibility for any human to assume, not that this keeps the control freaks from continuing to try. So a lot of people think that actually the beginning of digital and technology, it's going to make it easier to control. I think the need or the want of government to track all its citizens is not a recent phenomenon. I think it's been a view of government and tyrannical dictators and crazy people. It's been a want and desire of them for a while. But it's funny that it's kind of come about unintentionally today anyways. Everyone's got a cell phone. And I think every cell phone has GPS in it. So, and apparently it even works when the cell phones are off. And you have to take the battery out. I don't know if that's exactly true, but so there's great fears today of mass surveillance. Like even you hear in the United States going on right now about emails, that the government collecting emails and collecting phone calls, and Obama having to go on and make speeches to calm his citizens that he's not listening in on everyone's phone call. That kind of stuff is happening, and it seems almost inevitable. And another interesting point about that, if you played a game called Deus Ex, which is a very interesting, futuristic, and philosophical video game, believe it or not, trust me. There's a point in which you talk to a blue orb, and if you look in my one of my playlists, I'm not sure, I think it's called Reminders of the Larger Issues. I've got a favorite. One of the videos in there is a discussion between the main character and a blue orb, and this blue orb is a computer program, and its job is to collect information, collect data, which is happening today. And he says that in human history, humans have always wanted to look up to something for judgment. In the past, that's been gods and religion. In the last maybe 200 years, that's been celebrities. As increasing atheism come about, people now look up to celebrities. Oh, that's why I've called them demigods in some of my other videos, celebrities, movie celebrities, whatever, any kind of celebrity. They've looked up to them as for judgment, what they're doing. I want to be like them. I want to be like Justin Bieber, that kind of stuff, right? Human beings have looked for judgment. They wanted to look up to something, to be compared to be judged. Soon, and it's becoming more and more, people are going to want to be judged by computer programs. How is that happening already? Consider software that tracks your purchases, like ads on the internet, like Amazon, for example, and then give you ads that reflect your buying habits or points you receive for doing certain things, for buying certain things or whatever. This is the beginning of judgment of your character and your devotion to a brand, for example, devotion to music or to bands or something like that, to get points and rewards for certain things, or to be a Sears, which is a clothing store in Canada. Actually, I think they're almost gone now. A lot of their stores are closed. A Sears club member, that kind of stuff. All of that is, again, a new way of being compared and judged and measured and graded. And it seems to be a fact of human nature that we wish to be graded on a sheet. How well are we doing? How well am I being a blank, fan of or member of, or how well am I promoting? So consider environmental advocacy groups or any kind of advocacy group that provides some kind of little rewards for people based on their how much they donate, or all kinds of ways of giving badges and awards to people today, gold stars. Of the digital world, a new way of keeping people attached and devoted to something larger than them. Charity groups, how much people donate to a charity, maybe they get maybe certain colored badges, or all kinds of ways in which the digital world is doing this now too. So I think that's where the world's going. I think that's an interesting point. Okay, on page 50, he mentions a point that's always been a problem in political philosophy. So he says here that an act that would be a loathsome crime if committed by an individual is pardonable when committed by a state. This is a problem in political philosophy. How is it that if I attack someone, I get charged with assault, but we can, as a group, we can establish police that have a license to assault and kill? How is that okay, but I can't do that? How is an individual's morality different, and even opposite, than a group's morality? This is a problem in political philosophy. At what point can you ground certain moralities or certain conduct based on whether an individual does it or a group, and whether a group of people can endorse an individual to do certain things? This is a big issue, and Hitchens brings it up here. And I think some people would say that the individual is not the goal of justice or of morality even. They would say that civilization is. Even Hobbes took this argument. Even Hobbes said that the goal is creating a civilization. And human nature does not permit civilization because human nature is greedy and violent and whatever. And so we have to impose on the humans to create the civilization. So for most people in political philosophy, this might be quite doctrinal today, quite absolute. Very few people dissent from this view in political philosophy today, that civilization is the goal. And whatever we have to do to force people to live civilized, we will. That is probably the axiom of political philosophy today. But you can find dissension. It's just harder to find. You won't find people in universities that dissent from it. I don't. But you can find literature that does dissent from it. And on page 51, we get a bit of Hitchen's political philosophy, which is interesting. So he says, we are an adaptable species, and this adaptability has enabled us to survive. However, adaptability can also constitute a threat. We may become habituated to certain dangers and fail to recognize them until it's too late. Nuclear armaments are the most conspicuous example. As you read this, you are ineffective wearing a military uniform and sitting in a very exposed trench. You exist at the whim of people whose power does not derive from your own consent, and who regard you as expendable, disposable. You merely fail to notice the moment at which you are conscripted. A normal life consists in living as if this most salient of facts was not a fact at all. So there's a next part, but I'm just going to talk about that briefly. It's interesting because people talk about the social contract, like we all, by living in society somewhere, we are complicit and comply with its laws, such as taxes and all those kinds of things. And if we don't comply, then by still being here and not leaving, that it's perfectly justified for us to be attacked and imprisoned. And he's saying here is also that there are people in government that could conscript, can impose conscription, and can they in a sense, this is kind of the libertarian critique and the anarchist critique, is that when you are living in a society, you do not fully control yourself or own yourself. You are, especially in the U.S. and other parts like Israel and Japan, which I think have mandatory, and China, mandatory military service for all. I think it's all men, but it might have been changed to both men and women in their early 20s. And living in a society, you are in a somewhat of a cage, and you are not free. And the state can impose on you certain things under certain conditions, whatever they think is reasonable, which is always in quotation marks. Reasonable is probably the most undefined word ever. What is reasonable? Like, that always requires a context, and that context is never defined. But that becomes a very big problem for some people. They don't like being under the boot of society. They don't like being dispendable. They don't like having the thought that technically, as Hitchen says, we all are wearing military uniforms, and at any moment we all could be at war for something frivolous. And what's going to happen? You either go to war, or you go to jail. And luckily today we live in a society in which, unlike in World War II in Russia, we're not shot for not showing up for military service. But that's the harsh reality of societies today, is that as much as we call them civilized, at their very basis is coercion. And for a lot of people, that is not a happy thing. They would rather live elsewhere. They would rather live peacefully. And there's been a lot of recent critiques and recent awareness that we should try to become a more peaceful society and impose on one another less. That's a right-wing critique. Left-wing, of course, do not endorse it at all, because they don't even for the slightest believe that people should be free, or are free, or should be free. And so they don't care about that. They just care that everyone comes out with an equal, decent living. They see people as absolutely expendable, absolutely expendable to the common welfare. That's their God. The far left's God is they try to attempt a stable society. The far right wing's God is individual freedom. So that they're completely opposite. But let me keep going with then a little bit more of Hitchen's then take on that idea. He says, I tell myself every day that I do not recognize the legitimacy of a government that puts me in this position. I do not grant even my elected leaders the power of life and death over myself, let alone over all present, future, and indeed past forms of life, all of which they arrogate the right to extirpate at an instant's notice. What are you going to do if there's police with riot gear on your street and they're hauling people out of your apartment building? They're not going to tell you why. What are you going to do about that? That can happen. And that's what's a little bit scary about living in a civilized society, is that habeas corpus can be suspended. And I think the only country in the world has a piece of paper to prevent that, and that is the U.S. Constitution. But what's not very secure about that is that the government can suspend the Constitution, and then they suspend habeas corpus, and they can do whatever they like. They'll deal with rebels, but they can do whatever they want. It used to be for the longest time that religion held people to a standard, although you could argue whether the European monarchies really were holding that standard, because they were considered divine kings and could do whatever they wanted, really, and they would be endorsed by God. There has never really been, even religion may have been the closest thing, but there has never, ever been something to prevent people from doing terrible things. There is no, we're not living in a universe in which there are certain actions that are just stopped through some kind of miracle. And even people's consciousnesses are not stopped, are not controlled, are not. Hideous and horrible and evil acts can be committed at any time. There is no stopping it. And governments do it a lot. And there's nothing to stop them either. That's what's really unfortunate. And yet we live in a society, as Hitchen says here, that puts us in that kind of threat. That puts us on the line. That says that, yeah, you can live in civilization, but just note that one day you may be sacrificed. That can happen. And Hitchens says, no, I do not recognize anyone's claim on my life. That's kind of actually the Atlas Shrugged message. But where do you find them? And if you were to live in a stateless society, could you be guaranteed that still? Or would you be run over by the first murderer? It just may be that security in that sense, security of person, is nowhere to be found in this universe. It's nowhere to be found living in a stateless society in the woods somewhere, because you can be attacked by anybody that comes by. And it's nowhere to be found in civilization, because in civilization, you are not randomly attacked, you are systematically attacked through taxes. So there is no, I want to say, Huckleberry Finn, or there might be, I guess Huckleberry Finn will do. There is no Robinson Crusoe, I think is a better example. There is no island existence for any of us. We are chained just variably across the world. And unfortunately, I do not think that that's going to win out. Like, you could take the view that over time, people will simply move to countries that give them more freedom and more economic rights, more economic security, that their property security. Like, for example, I know in the States there's a state called New Hampshire where there's people that are trying to, it's called the Free State Project. There's people there that are trying to amass, they're trying to get people to move there and to get a critical mass of people that would vote in then politicians that would keep New Hampshire as a low tax state, low burden state on its citizens. Unfortunately, I think the world's going the opposite way. I think the world, and it's going to end up in an economic crisis. The world is actually moving towards people are happy to pay more taxes for more security, but economically, it's not going to work. So, and actually, on that exact point, which I did not predict, this is on page 55. He says, there may be people who wish to live their lives under a cradle-to-grave divine supervision, a permanent surveillance and monitoring. Absolutely, and I think the more a person is dependent on the state for money, they're the people who are going to vote for this and impose it on the rest of us. And another point I want to make is just kind of a paraphrase of what he's been saying through the last 10 pages or so, is that I see a kind of a comparison. Most people think that religious people are right-wing, right? But often there's commonalities with them and left-wing, because left-wing want to control people. They don't believe in human freedom because they see human freedom as creating inequality, and they think it's not equal. And it doesn't bring happiness. Comes about only when people are equal. So they want to get rid of inequality, and have to get rid of inequality with humans. You have to get rid of freedom. That's the left-wing view. So they want to control everything, right? They want to create a manufactured society. So do religious people. The only difference is the allegation of power. The religious are not anarchists, of course. They believe that the state has some power. Just like that quote, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's, right? They're complicit with the state. They just want some part of the power. They want to relegate some power to the state and some power to them. So they're both control people. They're both collectivists, if you want to use the Ayn Rand phrase. The socialists want to control it all through the state, secular. Religious people want to have some part in the control. They want the state to protect probably violence and economic stuff, probably fraud and all that. And then they want the church to protect moral interests and punish dissidents, punish homosexuals, probably punish maybe do a divorce, infidelity, that kind of stuff. So they're both control. They both are trying to create maybe utopia. I guess that's probably true as well. But the religious just want to have some of that power to themselves. The socialists want it all.